Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to discuss something that is in the book, The Mad Mullah of Somaliland by Douglas Jardine. I'm not going to read a part of it as I do in the other videos. Now, there is a video I did where I discussed the different nationalities that got involved in the what came to be known as the Dervish Wars from 1899 to maybe 1920 or around there. And I talked about the Indians, the Pakistanis, of course, the British, and of course, I talked about the King Africa Rivals, which was a unit of soldiers from different places in Africa, the East Africa Protectorate, maybe Zimbabwe, Zambia, those regions, and all the way to West Africa. Actually, came to realize that there were a few that came from Gambia and maybe Nigeria, Ghana, those sides of Africa. So it was a unit that had people from all over Africa. But then I did not mention one very critical player in that war, and that is Abyssinia. Abyssinia was a critical player in the war, and when you look at these other people, the Indians, the Pakistanis, maybe you can call them today the Kenyans, even though that's not what they were, the Ugandans or Bugandans, the Nigerians, the Ghanaians, the Gambians, all these people, and maybe to some extent South Africans, all these people, they themselves have an issue with what was happening in Somaliland. It did not concern them. They were just people who had been hired by the British, and they served the crown. That's all they wanted to do. They had allegiance to the crown, and maybe they were motivated, of course, by a salary or something of sorts. They did not have a philosophical or an ideological issue in that land. It was far away from their home. But the Abyssinians, it was personal to them. It was very personal to them. And the reason why it was very personal to the Abyssinians is because, of course, um, they border Somaliland, or they bordered Somaliland, and for them, um, they were also independent at this time. The Abyssinians were independent, of course. We say they were never colonized, but the Abyssinians also participated in the treaties that were signed by the colonial powers, maybe directly, maybe indirectly. I can't talk about that, but what is clear is that they were involved in those treaties. They did actually sign some treaties. We can easily establish, even by a simple research, that they did sign a few treaties. For example, they signed a treaty with the British. That's no secret. Most likely they did with the Italians, maybe with the French. I'm not so sure, but they did sign those treaties, and they did. So they did have a say, a huge say. And another issue that made the Abyssinians to be so involved in the war is the region of Ogaden. Ogaden has always been that tricky, sensitive part of Abyssinia or Ethiopia today, because, and it's a similar case to what we have in Kenya, of course, the northeastern part of Kenya, it is called the northern frontier region. And it is that it's a region, the Ogaden, that are occupied by ethnically Somali people. And these people, of course, had these feelings of wanting to be part of the bigger Somali nation. And of course, that was problematic. So the Ethiopians, the Abyssinians, well, they needed to get involved. It was important for them to get involved. And in fact, when you read Douglas Jardine's book, you realize that the Abyssinians would even propose expeditions. For example, Menelik II seems to have been the person who proposed the very first expedition against Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. And yeah, so for them that was important. And they did participate in so many of these expeditions alongside the British, even though sometimes they seem to have not been actively gotten involved in the wars or the battles. Sometimes they just stood by and watched the British fighting the army of the Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. But they were part of it, and often it seems like often what they were doing, they just needed to protect their border. That's all they did. They seems like they were not, if it happened in within the British territory, they did not want to get involved. If it happened on their side, then they would want to be involved. So The Abyssinians played a major role in that conflict. They were a very important participant in that conflict. And there are reasons, of course, as I've said, why they needed to participate. And that's because they needed to protect their territory. The territory they consider, some people will be like, oh, it's not their territory. Going by the treaties that had been signed, that was their territory legally. So they felt they needed to protect it. And we need to remember that Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, his father, came from Ogaden. And that made it very important for the Abyssinians to be involved, because Muhammad Abdullah Hassan is leading this revolt or this war against the British. But the Abyssinians know, if this guy succeeds in Somaliland to drive away the British, this guy is easily going to turn around and, of course, fight us, because his father comes from a region that we control. So the Abyssinians were very, very critical participants of the Dervish wars. Those are my random thoughts.